part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. My name is Ben Billman. I look forward to having you for the next 40 minutes or so as we talk about college basketball, what's going on in the sport, what's coming up in the next couple days, and also looking at the 10 best college basketball teams of the 21st century that did not win a national championship. That will take place during the second half of this podcast, so make sure to stay tuned for that as well. But during the first half, I want to look at what's been going on in the world of college basketball, and there's one team that I really want to focus on. But first, let's go over what's happened in the past week. So looking at some of the major matchups in the past few days, first of all, some big-time matchups, some rivalries that took place. Kentucky beat Louisville, which I expected. Louisville, again, is a mess right now. They really don't have any direction or future. I'm not sure where they're headed when it comes to ACC play. They look like a complete mess. On the other hand, Kentucky has stepped it up in recent weeks. We talked last week about that big win over North Carolina. Now they beat in-state rival Louisville. They look like the best team in the SEC heading into conference season that will begin in January. So that was a big win. The other big rivalry game that took place was Missouri and Illinois, with Illinois winning that matchup pretty handily over the Missouri Tigers. Missouri, a big question mark after being a second-round team last year in the NCAA tournament. I don't know where they stand going into the SEC, but with Illinois, they have positioned themselves as the second best team, very clear-cut, right behind Purdue in the Big Ten, heading into the Big Ten. So those two games really stood out. But the game of the weekend, and really the biggest game, maybe even in college basketball all season, was between Florida Atlantic and Arizona. That took place in Arizona, so a big advantage for the Wildcats, and Florida Atlantic looking for a win heading into American Athletic Conference play, desperate for a win to keep their chances of a high seed alive. Florida Atlantic wins that game in double overtime, 96-95, and now the question has to be asked, does Florida Atlantic have a chance at a number one seed? After this win, they moved to 10-2 on the season. They only have one game left before they enter into AAC play. The biggest problem for Florida Atlantic at this point is that the AAC is not going to help them in terms of strength of schedule. So when the committee looks at their schedule heading into March Madness, what are they going to look at? Well, looking back at their non-conference schedule, they have wins over Butler, who is a lot improved over last year, Texas A&M, who at the time was number 12, and I still think has a chance to finish pretty high in the Southeastern Conference, wins over Virginia Tech, Liberty, and now Arizona. So a lot of quality wins, but unfortunately, one loss really sticks out, and I hate to say it, but even if they run the table in the AAC or get close to it, their loss to Bryant really sticks out. They lost to Bryant in the third game of their season, 61-52, and their only other loss is an understandable loss to Illinois. They lost by 9 points. So, their non-conference schedule matches up pretty well, both in record and strength of schedule against some of the big-time teams that are going for number one seeds. The only problem is that in their conference schedule, the only other team that I look at as being a strength of schedule booster is Memphis. Memphis sits at number 19 right now, and Florida Atlantic plays Memphis in 2 of their last 4 games of the season. So if Florida Atlantic is going to have any chance at a number 1 seed, they're going to need to sweep Memphis. They probably can't afford more than 1 or 2 losses in conference play, and they absolutely need to win their conference tournament. So is Florida Atlantic in the race for a number 1 seed, or are they out of the race for a number 1 seed because of the conference they play in? Well, I would argue that I would replace Gonzaga, who is usually in the running for a number 1 seed, and I would replace Florida Atlantic as the team outside of the power conferences that has a chance. It's a slim chance, and I'll go through some of those teams that I think have a better chance. Again, it really comes down to strength of schedule for Florida Atlantic, and then also that tough loss to Bryant in the early non-conference schedule. So I'm going to go through and look at some of the major conferences and see which of these teams is in the running for a number 1 seed and why they are, and then also then comparing them to Florida Atlantic, and is Florida Atlantic really in the same group when it comes to quality and strength of schedule. So first of all, looking at the top 25 and seeing where we stand with some of the teams going into 2024. First of all, the top 5 stayed the same, with Purdue, Kansas, Houston, Arizona, and Connecticut. Arizona did not move down, which surprises me a little bit after that loss to Florida Atlantic. Tennessee moved up 2 spots, Florida Atlantic up to number 7, Kentucky, North Carolina, and then Marquette dropping down to number 10. That is the top 10. A couple other teams this week that fell pretty drastically, and again, I don't know where these teams stand going in to the conference season. First of all, Creighton, the Creighton Blue Jays, dropped all the way to number 22 after losing 2 of their last 3 games, and 2 games that are going to look pretty poorly on their schedule, in my opinion, when it gets to March. First of all, losing to UNLV by 15, and then also losing to Villanova in overtime by 2. I don't see either of those teams making a huge splash in conference season. Maybe Villanova can finish in the middle of the pack in the Big East, but I don't see them challenging for a Big East championship. So that really is a costly loss to Creighton to start off in the Big East Conference play. The other problem for Creighton is that with the Big East being as loaded as they are, they're going to have major challenges throughout the Big East schedule, and therefore Creighton needs to be very careful. And again, talking more about the number 1 seed and the chances of it, I think Creighton can be removed from that discussion just because the strength and the depth of the Big East overall. And the other team that fell fairly drastically over the last week or so is Baylor. Last week we talked a little bit about the Michigan State Baylor team, Michigan State being on the ropes and looking for a big-time win to get their season back on track. They were able to beat Baylor by 24 points, and then Baylor followed that up with a loss to Duke by 8. Now, they did rebound with a win over a very poor Mississippi Valley State team, and they've got one more game against Cornell before they head into Big 12 play. Similar to Creighton, though, Baylor heads into the Big 12, which in my opinion is the best conference in the nation. Now Baylor has to look at themselves and think about, okay, we've got Baylor, or we've got BYU, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Houston. These are all teams that heading into the Big 12 are playing at a pretty high level. So what does that mean for us when we've lost 2 of our last 3 and have so many questions heading into the Big 12 in the early 2024 time period. So that's where Baylor has to be concerned, and I'm very concerned with Baylor right now as well because of that fact. So going back to the top 25, again, Baylor has fallen to number 17, and Creighton has fallen to number 10. Some teams to keep an eye on moving forward. Any team in the Big 12 deserves an eye on them. First of all, Houston at number 3. They're probably the favorite heading into Big 12 play, but the Big 12 is so deep with Kansas at number 2. Houston undefeated, though. I'd give them the very slight edge over Kansas right now, but that is very slight. Some other teams to keep an eye on. I already mentioned Gonzaga. Gonzaga is 9-3, and I don't think they have a chance at a number 1 seed. They've had some big opportunities recently to get some big quality wins. They haven't come through. And even though they sit at number 13, I just don't see a path to a number 1 seed for them. Oklahoma picked up their first loss of the season, so they are no longer a member of that undefeated class. 2 other members along with Houston that are still undefeated. First of all, James Madison sat at number 20, but they are still undefeated. I think they're in the same boat as a lot of teams at the mid-major level, that because their conference just does not give them many opportunities for big wins. I don't know how much James Madison can move up in the rankings because most of their wins from here on out are going to be expected wins, and they probably will not be challenged very much. The other undefeated team at number 24 is Mississippi. Now, I mentioned them last week, Chris Beard being the head coach there. In his first year in Oxford, has Mississippi sitting at 12-0 and number 24. That is a team that is going to be scary in the Southeastern Conference. I would not be surprised to see Chris Beard get that team to March, and it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to see that team move far because of his coaching ability. The other newcomer to the top 25 is Providence in the Big East, and again, that just shows the depth of the Big East. Some teams to keep an eye on heading into the conference portion of our season. First of all, Virginia, a team that we've talked about before, still looking for a direction on where Tony Bennett is going with that team. Another team which I think could be a riser as we move forward in the season is Nevada. Steve Alford has done a great job there, and Nevada sits with only 1 loss heading into Mountain West Conference play. And Ohio State in a Big Ten, other than Purdue and to an extent Illinois, that conference is fairly wide open, and Ohio State has a real chance to do well there. Michigan State is sneaking back up, so keep an eye on them as well. And then also New Mexico in the Mountain West as well. The Mountain West looks like a multi-bid March Madness conference. I wouldn't be surprised to see 3 or 4 teams from that conference make it into March Madness. So that is a conference overall to keep an eye on. Okay, so looking forward, I want to go through a list of teams that I think still have a chance at a number 1 seed. And again, is Florida Atlantic a team that can compete at this level and maybe pull out a number 1 seed? So again, looking at Florida Atlantic, I think they do have a chance. And here are some other teams that I think are still in the running for a number 1 seed. So first of all, in the ACC, North Carolina, even with the loss to Kentucky earlier this season, they still have a lot of experience and a lot of players that remain from that team that went all the way to the championship game in 2022. Other than North Carolina, though, maybe Duke, if they can get their season on the right track in the ACC, but I think because of some of the losses they've had already, they might be out of the running. Some people might put Clemson in the conversation as still a potential number one seed, but their non-conference schedule was pretty weak, and I don't know if the strength of schedule is going to be there unless they were somehow able to win the regular season and the conference tournament in the Atlantic Coast Conference. In the Big 12, there are multiple teams that still have a chance at the number one seed, but unfortunately, I think it's going to be a dog-eat-dog type competition all season in the Big 12. But right now, if there were some teams that have a chance at a number one seed, it would be Houston, BYU, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I think Baylor, to an extent, has fallen out of that, and I think it might be a struggle to stay at the top of the standings in the Big 12. But with Houston and Kansas, absolutely. If they can win the Big 12, even if they pull off or lose a couple games throughout conference play, they still, because of the challenges that they've had, because of the strength of schedule in non-conference, they both have a real good chance to get number one seeds. And then also BYU and Oklahoma. Those are two teams that had very strong non-conference schedules. And if they can compete at the top of the Big 12, it wouldn't surprise me if they are both in that discussion for number one seeds at the end of the year. In the Big East at this point, I think there's only one team that I would look at and say this team has a chance at a number one seed, and that is Connecticut. They've played a great schedule. They have a great record. And with Marquette and Creighton falling back a little bit heading into the Big East, I think Connecticut has a real opportunity to continue their success. They only have 2 losses on the season. They're a real threat at a number one seed. In the Big Ten, there's only 2 teams I would look at and say at this point in the season, with the way they're playing, these 2 teams have a chance, and that would be Purdue and Illinois. Again, Illinois won that big game over Missouri. Purdue still has only 1 loss on the season. If Purdue is not a number one seed heading into March, Matt Painter should be very disappointed in himself and in that team. Illinois has an outside shot. I think they would need to either win the Big Ten regular season or the Big Ten tournament to be in that discussion. But I have a real thought that they might be in that discussion at the end of the year. Okay, so moving down to the Southeastern Conference, I think Kentucky and Tennessee are the 2 teams there that have a shot at number one seeds, and I think they both have a good shot, especially if they run through the Southeastern Conference and, again, win the regular season or the conference tournament. Other than those 2, Mississippi, again, is a dark horse. I really don't know where they stand and what they have, what they'll bring to the table. When they get to conference play, they've had a pretty easy schedule so far. That will stiffen up when it comes to competition in conference play. In the Pac-12, there's one team and one team only that has a chance, and that's Arizona. They do come off that loss to Florida Atlantic, but the Pac-12 is very weak this year. Arizona at this point is the only top 25 team in conference. They're going to need to dominate that conference to be in the discussion for number one seed, but if they do dominate, I think they're a clear-cut number one seed. And then finally, always a debatable topic with Gonzaga. Being in the West Coast Conference, I just don't see them having a number one seed chance this year. The West Coast Conference isn't as strong as it normally is. St. Mary's is way down. San Francisco doesn't look great. So I think Gonzaga is out of that discussion. So looking across the board in college basketball, yes, I think Florida Atlantic has a real chance. The Big 12, I think, is going to beat each other up, and they won't get more than one number one seed. The Big East, other than Connecticut, I just don't see it. Purdue's in that discussion. Arizona's in that discussion. I think Kentucky and Tennessee, one of those might get knocked out by the other. There's going to have to be a lot that happens for Florida Atlantic to get to that number one seed line, but it's still in the realm of possibility. And that would be an incredible transition from last year making the Final Four, this year moving to the American Athletic Conference, and this year also getting a number 1 seed. It would be a remarkable program success if they were able to do that. So those are some of the things to look for. Again, things don't really heat up in college basketball till after the new year. So next episode, I'm going to look at as teams finish up non-conference play, and then as we get into the conference, it's going to get very interesting. And this whole topic of which teams have a chance to win a conference championship, those will start taking shape. And some of these teams that are still undefeated, such as Houston and Mississippi, when do they receive their first loss? And that will be a topic that we discuss when that does happen. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we will come back with the top teams, the top 10 teams of the 21st century that did not win the national championship.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tybus Powell.
And we are your hosts of the Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tybus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
All right, welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast, ready for the second half. And as promised last week and as told earlier in this episode, we are now going to go over the top 10 teams that did not win the national championship in the 21st century. So I put together my list. I'd love to hear your list, or if there are any teams that I left off that you would have put on this list. So let's get started with number 10 on the top 10 college basketball teams of the 21st century that did not win a national championship. Now, last week I explained that any champions that had their titles revoked, such as the 2013 Louisville Cardinals, I would not include on that top 10 list. But I'm going to make an exception for this list because the 2008 Memphis Tigers, they had their Final Four banner revoked because of NCAA violations. But I'm still going to include them on this list because they did not win a national championship, and yet they were still a fantastic team. So number 10 on my list is the 2008 Memphis Tigers. This is when John Calipari was still the coach at Memphis. This is also the same year that all the number 1 seeds made it to the Final Four. Memphis ended up making it to the national championship game, but losing to Kansas, which was on my top 10 list last week when Mario Chalmers hit the buzzer beater to send it to overtime, and Kansas went on to win in that overtime period. Now, this Memphis team, though, had a lot of talent, and they're best known for having the one-and-done player Derrick Rose, maybe the best one-and-done player outside of Anthony Davis that we've had during the one-and-done era. The breakdown of this team was free throw shooting. If you go back and watch the last 2 minutes of that national championship game, Memphis missed some crucial free throws that would have sealed the national championship for them. But unfortunately, they missed those. They left the door open, and Kansas took advantage. John Calipari would move on to Kentucky just a couple years later. And again, because of violations, this Final Four trip for Memphis was taken away. But the guard duo of Derrick Rose and Chris Douglas Roberts, that was one of the best guard duos I've seen in a long time. So I do include Memphis on this list, even though they had violations, and they are at number 10. At number 9 on my list, and this is going to be a very busy year on this list, is the 2015 year. I have 3 teams on my top 10 that all were in the 2014-2015 season. The first of those being at number 9, the Arizona Wildcats. This is back when Sean Miller was still coaching there before he got fired for violations in recruiting at Arizona. But this team finished 34-4, 16-2 in the Pac-12. They had players such as Stanley Johnson, Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, TJ McConnell, Gabe York. Those were some of the leaders on this team. 2015 might have been the most loaded tournament bracket I can remember. Arizona made it all the way to the Elite Eight before losing to the Wisconsin Badgers in a super tight game that came down to the final possession. So I have Arizona at number 9 on my list. And again, we may or may not, well, we will. We will see that Wisconsin team later on in this list as well. So the 2015 Arizona Wildcats finish in the 9th spot. At number 8 on my list, I have the 2013-2014 Florida Gators. Again, this was back when Billy Donovan was coaching at Florida. He had won back-to-back championships in 2006 and 2007, and this team in 2014 had a real shot to win a national championship. The 2014 Florida Gators won 30 games in a row heading into the Final Four. They made it all the way to the Final Four. At one point, they were 6-2. Heading in to the Final Four, they were 36-2. Had an amazing team, but unfortunately, the one team that took them down, actually 2 of their 3 losses that year, were the UConn Huskies. For some reason, the UConn Huskies had their number that year. Florida was by far the highest ranked team going into the Final Four, but unfortunately, Connecticut took them down. This team had Michael Frazier, Dorian Finney-Smith, and probably the best player when it came to the college game, Scotty Wilbekin, at point guard. 30 wins in a row, a great team that Billy Donovan had, but unfortunately, they could not win the national championship. At number 7 on my list, I have the 2009-2010 Kansas Jayhawks. One of my favorite, if not the ultimate favorite when it comes to March Madness upsets, took place during the 2010 NCAA tournament when this Kansas team got taken down in the second round by Northern Iowa. Ali Farouk Manesh hit a huge three-pointer with about a minute to go to seal the game for Northern Iowa, and a crushing loss for a Kansas team that was number 1 for most of the season. They finished 33-3 on the year, and most people had them as their national champion that year, but unfortunately, they lost to Northern Iowa. Some of the names you may recognize from this team: Sharon Collins, Xavier Henry, the Morris twins of Marcus and Markieff Morris, Cole Aldrich, Tyshawn Taylor, Thomas Robinson, Jeff Withey. Those were all players that either were in the NBA or are still currently in the NBA. That team was absolutely loaded, and one of the biggest upsets and one of my favorite games ever in March Madness, the 2010 Kansas Jayhawks. At number 6 on my list, and this one, being a Big Ten fan, really hurts one of the most when it comes to teams that I thought should have won a national championship, but unfortunately came up short, and that was the 2004-2005 Illinois Fighting Illini. One of the most enjoyable teams to watch when it came to guard play, with Dee Brown, Deron Williams, and Luther Head, an unbelievable trio of guards that absolutely dominated the Big Ten that year, only losing one game in the regular season, and then unfortunately losing their second game in the national championship to North Carolina. At this point, Bill Self had moved on from Illinois to Kansas, and Bruce Weber had taken over at Illinois just a year or two earlier. He led this team all the way to the national championship. They had a record overall of 37-2. And again, that trio of guards played a huge role in this, but they also had NBA players in Roger Powell and James Augustine. They were one of the best ball movement teams that I've ever seen, and one of my ultimate favorite comebacks in March Madness took place with this team in the Elite Eight against Arizona. If you want to go back and watch one of the most incredible comebacks ever, just look up Illinois-Arizona in the 2005 Elite Eight. Illinois made a wild comeback to send that game to overtime and then to win in overtime. That was a special Illinois team, and they finished at number 6 on my list of the best teams in the 21st century not to win a national title. We are now into the top half of my list, the top 5. And this is when it gets truly heartbreaking with these teams that they were not able to pull out a national championship. So at number 5, I have the 2010-2011 Ohio State Buckeyes. This team entered March Madness with only 2 losses, had been dominant all season. This is back when Thad Matta was still coaching at Ohio State. He had just been to the national championship game a few years earlier in 2007, reformed the team, and now had them on the brink of a national championship. But unfortunately, this team was taken down in the Sweet 16 by a young but hungry Kentucky Wildcats team and lost in a very tough game. This Ohio State team, though, included Jared Solinger, Jordan Siebert, John Diebler, one of the best shooters in Big Ten history, David Leidy, Deshaun Thomas, one of the best point guards ever in college basketball, Aaron Kraft, and the names go on and on. This team was absolutely loaded. They dominated the Big Ten this year, but Kentucky took them down in the Sweet 16. Kentucky went on that year to make it to the Final Four before losing to Connecticut. But this Ohio State team was an amazing shooting team, great interior play, and taken down in the Sweet 16. All right, we're into the top 4. Number 4 on my list of the best teams to not win the national championship in the 21st century is the 2014-2015 Wisconsin Badgers. Now, I already told you 2015 was an incredible year for teams in the NCAA tournament, and that continues here at number 4. Bo Ryan had his best team in his time at Wisconsin. They had made the Final Four the year before, lost in the Final Four. This year they went a step further, made it to the national championship before losing to the Duke Blue Devils in the national championship. But one of the best games of all time in the Final Four, they played the 38-0 Kentucky Wildcats, who you might see later on this list, and they took down an undefeated 38-0 team that looked destined to walk away with the first undefeated season since 1976. But Wisconsin took them down with players such as Frank Kaminsky, Sam Decker, Nigel Hayes, Bronson Koenig, Josh Gasser, Travion Jackson. Just a loaded Wisconsin team, and really unfortunate that they pulled off a huge win in the Final Four, only to lose to Duke in the national championship. And back in that national championship game, too, Wisconsin had a pretty sizable lead with about 10 minutes to go before Duke really got going, took that game over, and took down Wisconsin in the national championship game. Speaking of the Duke Blue Devils, at number 3 on my list, I have the 2001-2002 Duke Blue Devils. This was the reigning national championship. They had won the championship in 2001, and they entered the NCAA tournament in 2002 as the number 1 overall seed. Again, Coach K being the head coach during this time period. The team entered March Madness with only 3 losses on the season. They had dominated the ACC, and again, looking to repeat as back-to-back national champions. They had players such as Jay Williams, Carlos Boozer, Mike Dunleavy, Dante Jones, Chris Duhon, Daniel Ewing, a lot of players on that list that were returnees from last year's team, so a lot of experience, a lot of tournament experience especially. But in the Sweet 16, the Indiana Hoosiers in Lexington, Kentucky, took down the Duke Blue Devils in a huge upset, and Duke unfortunately got way out-rebounded in that game and for some reason just fell apart down the stretch. Indiana went on to the national championship game before losing to Duke's ACC rival, the Maryland Terrapins, in that championship game. But a crushing loss for the Duke Blue Devils, and actually it took Coach K almost a full decade after this to get back to win another national championship. So number 3 on my list, I have the 2001-2002 Duke Blue Devils. Okay, these top 2 teams both entered the Final Four with undefeated records, and both of them looked like they were going to stroll to a national championship. Both of these teams lost, though, so at number 2, I'm going to put the 2020-2021 Gonzaga Bulldogs. Now, this was a wild year because it was the COVID year, so we did not have many fans in the stands at any home games or any away games. The whole NCAA tournament was played in the state of Indiana, and Gonzaga entered March Madness with an undefeated record, made it all the way to the national championship, which means that they entered the national championship 31-0. They absolutely dominated all the way through the whole season, and in the national semifinals, in the Final Four, Jalen Suggs hit a bank shot from half court to send the Bulldogs to the national championship game. In that game, they faced a very, very tough Baylor Bears team and ended up losing that game. And in all honesty, Baylor controlled that game from start to finish. Baylor got out to a quick start, led at halftime pretty largely, and didn't look back in the second half. This Gonzaga team included players such as Drew Timme, Corey Kispert, like I already mentioned, Jalen Suggs, Joel Ayayi, Andrew Nembhard, Julian Strother. A very loaded team. One win away from going undefeated, but unfortunately they could not do it. Mark Few has come so close so many times, and this was his best chance to win a national championship. And it makes you wonder, will he get back to that level? Can he get a team back to that championship level and maybe one of these days win a national championship? But as of right now, the 2020-2021 Gonzaga Bulldogs, the best team he's ever had and the second best team of the 21st century to not win a national championship. Now, if you follow college basketball, you can already probably predict who my number 1 team is on this list. One of the most dominant, most electric teams in the history of college basketball was the 2014-2015 Kentucky Wildcats. The third team from that 2015 March Madness field to be on this list after the Arizona Wildcats and the Wisconsin Badgers. Now Kentucky appears on this list as well. John Calipari put together a team of experience but also youth that was almost a perfect combination, and they entered the Final Four with a record of 38-0. And really, you can probably only look back at 1 or 2 games the whole season where they were even challenged, where the game came down at the end with the other team having a chance to win. That had not occurred in March Madness, though, up until the Elite Eight when Notre Dame took them down to the wire. Well, Kentucky entered the Final Four 38-0 and went up against a Wisconsin team that was solid, that had some NBA players like we already talked about, but Kentucky was just they could have just overmatched them if they wanted to. But Bo Ryan outcoached John Calipari, and Kentucky went down in the Final Four and finished the year with a record of 38-1. When you look at this Kentucky roster, if you were going to put this team currently as they are in the NBA, they would have a real chance to do well in the NBA. Here are some of the names from that team. Aaron Harrison and his twin Andrew, Karl Anthony Towns, Devin Booker, Willie Cauley-Stein, Trey Lyles, Dakari Johnson, Tyler Ulis, Alex Poitras, Marcus Lee, and there's a couple other names on that list I won't go into. But the point being that this team, you could have the starting five and the bench five, the backup five, could probably start for most teams and do pretty well overall. This team went 10 to 12 deep with NBA-type talent, but one of the biggest upsets ever in the Final Four, losing to Wisconsin. A great game if you want to go back and watch coaching masterpiece by Bo Ryan. This would be a game to go back and watch. Again, Wisconsin then advanced to the championship and lost to Duke. Just an amazing season overall in 2015. So just to recap on the top 10. At number 10, the 2008 Memphis Tigers. At number 9, the 2015 Arizona Wildcats. At number 8, the 2014 Florida Gators. At number 7, the 2010 Kansas Jayhawks. At number 6, the 2005 Illinois Fighting Illini. At number 5, the 2011 Ohio State Buckeyes. At number 4, the 2015 Wisconsin Badgers. At number 3, the 2002 Duke Blue Devils. At number 2, the 2021 Gonzaga Bulldogs. And at number 1, the best team to not win a national championship in the 21st century is the 2015 Kentucky Wildcats. So let me know what you think about that list, if I got it right, if there are any teams that I left off, or if you would have put any teams higher or lower. Well, again, I hope you had a great Christmas. I look forward to putting out some more podcasts after the New Year's Day. And I appreciate you listening to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. You all have a good rest of your day. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.